Hey guys, welcome out to Revolution tonight. So it's Friday night here in Australia. We're going to be looking at part two of the last six verses of Revelation. And so what I'm going to do, Jan Kranz has a video, a 36-minute video where he explains to some other guys on Zoom or just online about his understanding of what happened with Erasmus in the last six verses. And so, Jan Kranz, if you don't know who he is, I guess, he is in the school of, Bart Ehrman, Bruce Metzger. Um, he's contemporary with, people like, Elijah Hickson, Peter Gurry. um, James White looks up to Jan Kranz as a go-to type of guru for this type of information. And so what we're going to do through this process is we're going to learn some things because Jan Kranz is an expert on these issues. Now, I believe that Jan Kranz is wrong. There's so many holes in this story that I just can't believe it. It just sounds so far fetched to me that I know that on the other side of the fence, critical text people love to shout conspiracy theory, and as if that solves anything. Um, but what I find is this type of story is so strange and so weird and so out of character with um, with the rest of what Erasmus has done. Now, if you follow um, the anecdotes of Erasmus concerning the Comma Johanneum, then if you've already swallowed those, you might accept something like this, where, as I explained in my previous video, it's like the Three Stooges. They're constantly putting Erasmus, Stephanus, and Beza in that type of category where they just had these Joe Biden moments. They slipped on banana peels. They're just going through their life just filled with error, filled with blunder, and we look back at it as just this comedy of errors. But I just can't believe that. And I think it's actually insulting. And one of the things that I mentioned in my last video was I get grilled for questioning Kranz and Rummel and a few other people, but I'm questioning them in a sense of questioning, whether they've read the stats properly. I'm not saying, Kranz is just an absolute idiot or, he's a fool. But see, the thing is, they don't mind saying that about Erasmus. He just had a senior moment and forgot what he was doing. Or he just said, well, back translate it from the Aldine Bible, but didn't realize that that was pretty much his Bible anyway. So he didn't really fix the problem. It's just like this comedy of errors, and I that just doesn't sit right with me. And so, but what I thought I'd do, because I haven't really added anything from last week's discussion or the last video's discussion on this, I thought, well, I'll go through a video of Jan Kranz because that way I can slowly go through some of his material. And I'm not sure if I'll finish this in one session or if I'll, get halfway and have to do two or three. But however long it takes, we're going to examine these things. And hopefully we learn something. We're going to critique this. But ultimately, I want people to have an open mind. I know there are critical text guys who watch my videos because they mention it. I just ask you guys to have an open mind. Now, just one thing I want to bring up. There was a guy called, I think his name was Matthew Rose. Now, Matthew Rose has contacted me on Facebook, and straight away he's like, well, you're a King James only. And see, one of the things is, and Taylor DeSoto does an amazing job at clearing this type of thing up. James White, in his book, The King James Only Controversy, he basically says that there are 5 different types of King James only. But see, the thing is, there's usually only one type that is relevant. And so if I say I'm Textus Receptus only, most people go, oh, okay, that's different to King James only. James White, of course, conflates the two because he invented these 5 categories. And so he even puts Zane Hodges and majority text people in with King James, the 5 King James onlyists. It's just bizarre. So basically, he has your grandmother, just people who have just got the King James on the shelf, and they prefer that version. They don't want any modern version. They're actually King James only. And so um, what he does is he mixes the two. So he says, well, there's 5 categories, and the last one, or maybe the second last one as well, are sort of like the dangerous types. But these are King James onlyists. No, what they actually are is a group of people who don't agree with critical text people. They don't agree with James White's opinion, and so he's put them all into the same label. And so people and people all throughout the years, people like D.A. Waite has tried to distance himself from people like Ruckman, people like you know DeSoto. He's tried to distance himself, and these guys have written books about Gail Ripple. We don't agree with what she said over here, and we separate ourselves from these type of people, and all the rest of it. But James White's he doesn't care about that. He has no care, and one of the things that he harps on about is category distinctions, and also accurately representing your opponent. And so if we had Jehovah's Witnesses, if there were different types of cults in Jehovah's Witnessism, you would name those. And so we know that even within Catholicism, you've got Roman Catholicism, you've got Irish Catholics, you've got people like, say, what's his name, Mel Gibson. He has a different type of Catholicism. And so we also see Catholicism mixing in with pagan groups. Now, if I was to mix Catholicism with Orthodox, with Mormonism, with some, and put them all in the same groups, it's like, and call them all Catholics or something like that. It's not really, it doesn't really fit. And so you have to make those category distinctions. And so James White talks about those things with other groups, but when it comes to King James only, he has the 5, and that includes your grandma. That includes just the person who just goes, I prefer to read this one. And then it's got people like Zane Hodges, who are majority text people. So that would probably include people like James Snap. He would probably fall into the category of the majority text person, even though he specifically says he's not just majority text, he's equitable eclecticism. But then it goes, through to D.A. Waite types, and then the Ruckman types, and people. If I said to anyone who is a Christian who knows, just say I was out street preaching, I ran into a bunch of Christians, and I said, do you think King James onlyism is wrong? They would put their hand up and say, yes, absolutely, it's heretical, it's cultic, blah blah blah, because that's what they're taught to say about it. And then I'd be like, I prefer the King James, but I don't think it's inspired or anything like that. I prefer it. Am I a King James only? And they'd say no. But King James White puts you in one of those categories of King James only. You see the problem here. And so, and even if I said I'm majority text, most majority text people don't even come close to defending the King James. I mean, they might defend TR readings and accurate representations of that in the King James, but they're not like, hey, we defend the King James. Why would they be classified even as a part of the King James only movement? It's just ridiculous. And so, but this is the type of thing that we're seeing, and so this is the type of scholarship we're dealing with. And so, but anyway, let's move on to this video on Erasmus and the Greek text of Revelation, the last 6 verses. See what happens with this issue. See, this goes against what Erasmus believed and thought. Erasmus believed that Codex Vaticanus was a back translation from the Latin. And so he rejected that. He didn't like back translations from the Latin into the Greek. He said he was disgusted in that. And so here he is being accused of this. What he said he did was fix a manuscript that had clearly words missing through homoioteliton. Now, if something is missing through homoioteliton, you can correct it from other sources. And so this was clearly something that Erasmus, he said that he wasn't just copying from the Latin into the Greek. He was saying he saw homotheton in Greek manuscripts, plural, in Greek copies. So he had Greek copies, and then he said he fixed that. And so, a bit like if we were looking through an Arabic Bible and we saw it said, "For God so loved the world that whosoever believes in him," we know it's missing that he gave his only begotten son. It's like, oh, but it's in our English Bible, and we're like, well, it should be there. We know it should be there, and so we recognise that it was parablapsis, homotheton, whatever it is, and so then we've worded that in. It's not so much that it's come from Latin manuscripts or Latin tradition or whatever. We just know that that was um, that that was missing there. And Erasmus, knowing the level of Erasmus's Greek scholarship, knowing the people that he hung around, like Aldus, like Bombasius, people who were experts in the Greek language. He was part of the Aldine school, the Byzantine school, in Venice for many years. For several years, he was part of that with Greek-speaking Greek people, Greek scholars, and so he probably saw many um, texts of Revelation. And so in his travelings, he would have seen Latin. He would have seen many different languages as well. He's it's not like see how the critical text people um, view like the King James translators, Beza, Stephanus, Erasmus, or anyone who is against their position. They would just make up something like, "Oh, Erasmus never looked at anything but Latin and Greek." Yeah, but he was in England for quite a while, so he would have been looking at the English as well. He would have been looking at different things. He would have been inspecting libraries, inspecting manuscripts, looking at different readings. He did his own Latin translation many years before this, so he would have been thinking about these things. He was growing in this area of the Greek and the Latin for, for many, many, many years, and all the scholars around him were all interested in this, and so they would have been talking about these things. And so to just make out that he's just like some bumbling fool, who just didn't really know much and just found this manuscript and the end of it fell off, and this is how he's portrayed. So we want to go through and just check these things out. Let's examine these. And so part of that is looking at what Jan Franz says, because Jan Franz is probably up there with one of the leading experts in the world on Erasmus and on the Greek text. And there are other people out there who are less prominent. Jan, he seems to put his material out there so people can read it. Now, there is also the issue of Jan Franz's expose against Thomas Holland. So Thomas Holland, he wrote an article looking at Hoskia and looking at some of the quotations of Rummel, and he made a few mistakes in that. And Jan Franz, he wrote a 20-page article about that. And so we're going to bounce back and forward to those as we study through this. And also, Jan Franz has the book Beyond What Is Written. Now, Beyond What Is Written is basically examining conjecture with Erasmus and with Theodore Beza. So he would see this as conjecture, or the back translating. He mentions this. I think it's on about page 40 or so, give or take, 5 pages, but on his Beyond What Is Written book. And so we're going to go through that as well. I've already touched a little bit on that on my website and a few other things, but we're going to go through his material. That way, it's a bit of a segue to get to the original documents and original source material, because basically what Jan says is what critical text people believe. And so, and Jan is, in a sense, a step up from people like, say, James White. So You know, you look at James White, oh, he knows what he's saying, but he gets his information from Young. So some of the things that he said, like, you know, Erasmus didn't really have a high view of the book of Revelation, sort of saw it as, you know, not canonical, a sort of secondary work. You know, there were some books that people of that era thought that weren't canonical, that the books weren't canonical. And so it's sort of deuterocanonical. And you got to remember, this is before the Council of Trent. Council of Trent, they sort of went, okay, this is canonical, that's not. But before that, it was sort of left up to, I guess, individual groups, and people, they heard the voice of the shepherd. They understood, you know, the words, the books of the New Testament were inspired, and they knew there was a bunch of other books. But, you know, the Roman Catholic Church came along and said, well, this is what we're believing. So this is before that. This is before Trent, which I think was in 1546. But anyway, I'm going to just start because there's quite a lot of material, and Jan does go from point to point to point quite quickly. Like in 5 minutes, he can have mentioned, you know, 40 different things that can rabbit trail off into deep conversation. And so that's why I said I'm not going to rush through this. I'm going to try and do it as clearly as possible. So let's just start this.
So thank you very much, Jan. Over to you.
I think I might have to work on the volume there. Usually, for some reason, around about 60 is pretty good. That will do us. Okay. And volume there. Yeah, that's cool.
Speak on Erasmus and the Greek text of Revelation.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the occasion to see so many text-critical friends from all over the world. It's incredible, actually. Well, most of the text, the Textus Receptus of Revelation, goes back in a direct line to Erasmus' first edition of 1516. Some readings were changed, either by Erasmus himself in later editions or by later editors, but the textual core remained the same.
So I just want to firstly note that what seems to happen, what I've noticed that critical text people will do, is they try to have as many different compartments as possible, or many different steps, because then it's a chance for another error. And so, you know, he said, oh, Erasmus could have changed his text in later editions, or someone else. And so that whole, or someone else, that can be you know, Bruce Metzger does this quite a lot. He would just guess at something. You know, he'll say, well, this looks like an error, but perhaps Matthew made that error in the originals, you know, sort of thing. And you're left there going, how can you prove that? Or how can you disprove that? It's just this story. And so many times I'm found questioning these things. And so, yeah, just, you know, as soon as Jan's talking, he's saying, you know, it could have been Erasmus, or it could have been someone else, you know. And so we're sort of left there going, well, there's this other, who are these other people, the other editors? Okay, so the other editors sat down and said, look, we don't really like the way that Erasmus has done that. Well, let's change it. So just sort of, they could have been in error, or who are these people? And then there's a lot of speculation around that. So what I'm saying is that they'll get, and I've seen this a lot with James White, you know, he makes a lot about the different companies of the King James. Not that there was like 60 plus people working on the King James, and that should be an amazing thing. But he goes, no, they were in 3 different locations. So, of course, they couldn't even communicate with each other, sort of thing. It's like, how do you figure that? You know, and when you go through how they actually did the translation, it's quite remarkable that James White would even think that, you know, because they were doing their translation and sending it off to the other companies. And they were all, you know, noting things and sending it back and forward. And it's like, but just that whole thing of having a separation, it brings another, you know, another banana peel moment can happen. You know, oh, that's why they have kill in you know, one in Romans, and they have murder in, you know, Matthew, because, you know, they have different companies. You know, not kill and murder are just synonyms. yeah, today we might murder a chicken to eat it, we kill it, but it's like, words can morph and change, and that's fine. But what we've seen, like with young Franz, is he's sort of said that um, the text was of Reuchlin, which they say is the only one that Erasmus had. The text of Reuchlin was copied out probably by someone else, not Erasmus himself, where that seems to be the reading of Rummel. But other people like Andrew Brown and the website Christian Hospitality, they seem to have we extracted the text. So Erasmus and other people. So maybe he had a team of people. Maybe he had 5 people, 10 people. Who knows? But that's the thing. Some are saying I sort of commissioned someone to extract the text, and other people saying we. And so it just depends how you translate the Latin. So that gives a whole nother story where it's like, oh, who did Erasmus get? Oh, he got this other person who didn't really know that much, and he made his own errors, and then he gave it to Erasmus, and Erasmus made his own errors, then he gave it to his printers, and they made their. You see what I mean? It just becomes this Chinese whisper sort of thing, and so many different avenues for failure. That it's just another A to B situation, and between there is that you can just make up whatever story you want just to create another error or another chance for a banana peel situation. And so let's just continue. But I just sort of make that clear that Yarn seems to do this quite a lot. Critical text people do this frequently with the historical facts. Oops.
The preparation of the Greek 1516 text was a complicated task, since the only manuscript Erasmus had at his disposal in Basel was a minuscule commentary manuscript borrowed from Johannes Reuchlin, nowadays known as minuscule 2814.
And so I'm questioning that, because when you look at Erasmus, when Erasmus was questioned by Lee about these things and Stunica, he clearly said that he saw that there was an issue with homoieteiton in verse 19. He doesn't mention any other verses. And he says in the Greek there was homoieteiton, that's when you have similar endings. And so that's where he said there was some missing words. Now, they've found this manuscript, which is, it's most probably been owned by Reuchlin. It's manuscript 2814, and some people call it the Reuchlin's manuscript. There is one called Codex Reuchlinus or something, Reuchlin's Codex, which is something totally different. I think that's even a Hebrew manuscript. I could be wrong there, but Reuchlin, he had a lot of manuscripts in his day, and so he could have had many copies of this. It was quite popular, and so he could have had several of these, and this one might have just happened to have stopped there at the 16 verse 16 of chapter 22. When they found this manuscript, they've gone, oh, there's actually 6 verses there. Erasmus didn't talk about that. He must have been lying. Well, to me, I would go, hang on, are we 100% sure that that's the one he used? Or did Reuchlin have many, because even Erasmus says that Reuchlin, he has lots of manuscripts. He's like a collector of manuscripts. And so he might have said, look, he might have looked through and gone, actually, this is the better one to give to Erasmus. He gave him that one, knowing that it had the complete text in it. He might have had this other one to himself, and maybe later on, Erasmus might have been able to acquire that one and look at it. And so these are things that I'm looking at. I'm looking at whether that text is the actual text. I'm questioning that, because it just seems like as soon as that's come on the scene, all of a sudden, well, Erasmus is a liar. Why did he make up this story about So he's become a liar. Instead of maybe we've got the wrong manuscript. You see what I mean? I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. If we're in a court, I would like to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, and even give young Franz the benefit of the doubt, not saying that he's just lying about Erasmus and all the rest of it, but that probably he's reading material from people who have lied about Erasmus. Say someone like Ben Gull, who predicted that Jesus would come back in 1836, and it didn't work. He could have been the originator of this type of nonsense. And so anyway, let's just continue, because we're going to be looking at all these. I'm not making conclusive statements. I'm just asking questions. We're learning, we're critiquing, and we're evaluating everything. We're weighing up things. But from my perspective, to just say, oh, Erasmus is lying, that just doesn't sit right. And so I've got to look at every other option first.
Establishment of this 1516 text comprised of 3 steps. First, Erasmus had an assistant extract the text of Revelation from the manuscript.
So you notice how that has just become concrete. He had an assistant. So, but did Erasmus help the assistant? Because we're going to see that he's going to turn it into another chance for error to occur.
Second, he corrected this new intermediate manuscript. Third, the new manuscript was used by the typesetters to print the text.
And so basically what he's saying here is Erasmus got someone else to do it. Then Erasmus, he wrote some notes and things in that manuscript, and then he gave it to his typesetters to print it. And so he would have had to have done something like that. Like he would have had to extract the text. Like any commentary Bible, I can't see any commentary Bibles there, but if you have a commentary Bible, you might just have a whole bunch of commentary and a verse of scripture in the middle. And so you are taking those verses out. You don't want the whole thing. So you might have a whole page and there's only 3 or 4 lines in that page of actual Bible verse. And so that's what Erasmus was dealing with. He was dealing with a Greek manuscript or a Greek text of the book of Revelation, a commentary of Revelation. And he's getting these scripture verses out of there. But also, he's not just doing that. A commentary also talks about the text. And so when you see chatter about what the text is, that's what was interesting to Erasmus. So Erasmus, he related this back to Hippolytus, I think it was, in the year 200. So he's saying that even though he knows the text isn't that old, the manuscript isn't that old, he's saying that the text goes back to the year 200. And the commentary goes back that far, which is quite interesting.
All these steps were error-prone, and indeed they left their marks on the results.
So all these steps, you've got to divide them all up, and then you can have a banana peel experience between each. The more that you have, the more banana peel experiences you can have.
In copying, it was not always easy to separate text from commentary, or to deal with the many abbreviations found in the manuscript. Moreover, the manuscript.
So I've heard this quite a bit. Erasmus, he struggled to get the text out of the Greek. Now, I don't think that Erasmus would have struggled with the Greek. I mean, when you look at the manuscript, that was one of the things that was mentioned before the manuscript was found, that they say is the manuscript that Erasmus used. But when you look at that manuscript, if you can read Greek fluently like Erasmus could, you could easily go through and go, okay, well, that's scripture, and take it out. Okay, that's scripture, and take that out. Okay, that's scripture. And I'm pretty sure they even had like little inverted commas when there was scripture on the side. So you don't have to be a savant to figure it out, but that's what they're sort of making out. It was with great difficulty he did that. where I would say it was a laborious thing more than just a difficult, like, oh, this is driving me crazy sort of thing. It's like, no, they just copied it out. And so, yeah, that's what would have happened.
The manuscript itself was not without errors. In some places, for instance, text and commentary were not correctly distinguished.
Okay, so in some places the text and commentary were not correctly distinguished. And so I guess that's, because Jan Kranz is summarizing here, he's not putting anything up there where it says it happens here, 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 here. So, we have to look into those things ourselves.
Second, in editing, Erasmus had to decide on text critical problems, but he did not possess sufficient information.
Okay, so this is where it comes down to Erasmus didn't have correct information. He had this scanty sort of bunch of evidence, and it's quite interesting that if you were to ask, say, Stephen Boyce says that Erasmus, I think he had between 7 and 10 manuscripts. If you were to ask James White, he would say between 6 and 12 manuscripts. Then if you were to ask Dan Wallace, he would say he had 5 manuscripts, and that directly goes to the King James. So the King James is only based on 5 manuscripts. It's like, okay, how did you figure that out? The maths is just all over the place, and that's just that's with the overall number of manuscripts that Erasmus used. Then I've heard people say, no, there was probably about 20 manuscripts. So realistically, they're just guessing. They are just, they're going, oh, well, we think it's this and we think it's that. And the thing is, if this whole concept here is bogus about the last 12 verses, and this Reuchlin manuscript of 2814 is basically seen to not be the one that Erasmus used. Perhaps there's another one out there, or perhaps it was lost. This manuscript, 2814, that went missing for 300 years. So manuscripts can go missing; they can get destroyed. The problem is with text critical people, they talk about extant what we have today. It's like, oh, we've got 300 manuscripts of Revelation, and they have this reading. It's like, well, wouldn't you think that there would have been thousands and thousands of manuscripts of Revelation? And so to only have 300 left, it's like, yeah, we're glad that we have those left, but it's like that shouldn't be considered as the whole summary of everything. Surely there's been things over time that have been lost. And so this is one of the things where I've written a book about Revelation 16:5. And one of the concepts that's come up from that book is that it's not a conjectural emendation, as James White has said, or many people have said, or even Jan Kranz has mentioned, but actually Theodore Beza clearly says in his annotations that he had a manuscript. And so when that was pointed out, when Latin experts looking at that said, oh, actually, he does say he had a manuscript. It's just been misread. So for the last 100, 200 years, people have misread that. And now it's being read again a bit more carefully. And they're like, actually, he does say he has a manuscript. And other people in his era who translated his work into, say, English, they testify and say he clearly was saying he had a manuscript to back up the reading of Isomenos instead of Hosios. But Jan Kranz just goes, well, I think Beza just tricked himself with a former note that he made. It's like he tricked him. What? Instead of just saying, yeah, well, he said he had a manuscript, we take his word for it. Well, and the thing is, Beza's manuscript, where is that? It's just gone. It's gone in history. We don't know what it is. And it's sort of like people are only just starting to think about that in the last 6 months, a year. Wonder what that manuscript was. You know what I mean? And so this is how flimsy a lot of the critical text side is when it comes to these issues. The more you look at these issues and you start getting through all the weeds and spaghetti, and you realize, hang on, these guys really haven't done a lot of homework there. They might have sort of broadly gone over some things, but a lot of the time they're just making up anecdotes, Bart Ehrman type of things that, Jesus got angry with someone when he prayed for him, and that becomes like this huge big deal, and then they can sell books and write about it and all the rest of it. But it's like, I just see, like, say, Revelation 16:5. Why has it taken someone like me, or someone who they would consider an absolute nobody, like myself or Jeff Riddle, or anyone else? How come we're discovering these things? What are these guys doing? And then when we're putting it to them and saying, what about these? And they're going, oh, that gets in the way of our story. And so we can't say that these guys who are King James only people, we can't say that they got it right. And so we better make up another story that, Beezer just tricked himself. He had a Joe Biden moment. He was like, I don't know where I got that from, but I'll write in the annotations that it was from a manuscript, And that's what they're saying about Erasmus here. Erasmus was just fumbling through, and he just made up a whole bunch of stories. And then what happens is, then they retroactively, or probably not the best word, then they get that one incident and they spread it over the whole book of Revelation and say he only used one manuscript and it was this one, and look at the differences between that and what we have here. And so he must have that translated the Vulgate here and here and here and here. It's like, perhaps it wasn't that manuscript, or how do you? I know that he does say things that seem to be contrary, because he does say, "Oh, we only had one manuscript." But was that when he was actually extracting the manuscript? They only had that one manuscript. They had to travel somewhere to do that, and they didn't take any manuscripts with them, or And so this is the sort of thing that needs to be taken into consideration. All of this material. And so, but let's continue on.
His additional sources were mainly the Latin Vulgate, as he knew it, further readings.
So, usually the story is he translated the last 6 verses from the Latin Vulgate. But the thing was, Erasmus had done his own Greek edition. His own Latin edition in 1505, I think it was. So we're looking at, 11 years earlier. He's already done a Latin Bible. So wouldn't he be using that one? And so, but it's of the Latin Vulgate, and, but yeah, it would be interesting. I've heard some people say that actually, if you translate the Latin back into Greek, you don't get what Erasmus had. And so there's quite a few distinct things that are different. And so that's something that I've got to check. I'm not saying that's gospel, but I've got to check that out. It's worth thinking, worth studying through.
Mentioned in Valla's annotations, and perhaps a few readings known from other sources.
Okay, so he mentions Valla. So Lorenzo Valla, he was quite influential on Erasmus. Valla was the scholar who understood that the donation of Constantine was a forgery. Now, the donation of Constantine was basically sort of like a will and testament of Constantine. This is a very bad summary of history, but like a will and testament, basically saying that the Roman Catholic Church had the right to, the authority over the church, over churches, over certain lands and things like this, and that came directly from Constantine. So Lorenzo Valla proved that it was a fake, it was a forgery in his day. So I think he died like about 20 years before Erasmus was born. No, probably not. He was probably still alive when Erasmus was born. Anyway, I think it was about like around the time of the fall of Constantinople. And so he proved that it was a fake, and that was accepted by the Roman Catholic Church. They said, yeah, we know it's a fake. And he did his own annotations. Now, I've looked at his annotations at Revelation 16:5 when I wrote my book. And it was quite interesting. He thought it was an allusion to the Trinity, the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, the one who is and was and shall be. And it was like, okay, that's interesting. But I've got a picture of his annotations on my website. And so But I need to really go through what he says about these verses. It mightn't be anything spectacular or special, but these would have been things that Erasmus had access to. So that's one of the things we've got to look at when we're studying this. We want to know everything that Erasmus had access to. When he did his Latin in 1505, I'm pretty sure that's the year, when he did that, what did he have access to then? And what other things did he have access to before this time? So we want to know those things.
Or from earlier consultation of the Greek manuscript. Many Erasmian
So I'll just stop there because Jan said, he says one quick sentence and it's a whole bunch of stuff, so I'm trying to explain it. So, and then he's basically saying, or Erasmus, he probably used valor, which I think in Revelation chapter 8, in Erasmus's annotations, 8 verse 13, I think, he does mention Lorenzo Valor. And so then young friends are saying, well, we might have had other access to Greek manuscripts. And so, of course, if Erasmus has gone to England, then he's hanging around Europe, he's hanging around scholarship in Europe, and then he's also able to go to Venice, to Rome, Italy, around those places with Aldous. He is surrounded by Greek manuscripts. He is going through the libraries of these places. And book printing is only 70 years old. And so, yes, books are starting to get published, but what did they have before then? They had manuscripts. So he would have been going to libraries, seeing manuscripts, and you're probably looking at libraries. Some of these have burnt down to the ground and none of those manuscripts are left. You're looking at like World War II, 1 million biblical manuscripts were destroyed, 1 million. And so many, many documents, commentaries, bits of archaeological findings, rocks and things are destroyed, things with writing on them, manuscripts and Bibles.
Interventions took the form of retranslation from the Latin, not only in the well-known case of Revelations 22:16 to 21, where minuscule 2814 is defective, but at many other places as well. And third, in printing, the typesetters made some errors that were not always detected in time. As a result, the Greek text of Revelation in the 1516 edition diverges from the majority text, which itself in Revelation is often split.
Okay, so I just want to quickly give you an understanding of the majority text. And so what happens is, or what's happened in the 1980s, and it was a creeping thing. So the majority text movement, it seems to have started with people like Dean John William Burgon. So Dean Burgon, many people think he was a Textus Receptus defender. He actually wasn't. He defended what he called the traditional text. So the traditional text was sort of like a Byzantine text. And so if the Textus Receptus didn't gel with the Byzantine text, he didn't go with that. And he actually had went through Matthew from chapter 1 to chapter 14 and made, I think it was like 150 changes that he wanted to make just in those 14 chapters. And so he obviously wasn't defending the TR, and he says that. So I guess it's just an unfortunate thing in history where he has, in the time of Westcott and Hort, there weren't that many staunch TR defenders who were popular enough like Burgon to be able to stand against what was happening. And so many people think Scribner was a TR person. And so that was what I was mentioning earlier with Matthew Rose. He was sort of saying it about Scribner and all the rest of it. And I sort of rabbit trailed so far that I didn't answer. But Matthew Rose was saying, because in my last video I said, well, Scribner was basically a critical text guy. And he's like, where does it say that? And it's like, well, if you read his plain introduction, like I mentioned in my last video, he says, okay, Communihenium, delete it. Okay, this verse, delete it. This verse shouldn't be in there, delete it. And he's got many, many verses that he wants to delete, and many words, and he's very critical of the Textus Receptus, so he's not a TR person. best majority text, I guess you might say, but he worked on the Westcott and Hort Translation Committee, with them deciding on these issues. So the biggest critical text overthrow of the TR in history had Scrivener there working there. So just because he's printed a TR doesn't make him a TR guy. I mean, there are other editions earlier done by people who was staunchly not TR people, Greaseback, and you could look at their editions and say, oh, it's a TR, but these people are obviously against the TR. They're obviously the foundations of the critical text today. And so the things that Scrivener says about the King James Version, things that he says about the Textus Receptus, he is obviously not defending staunchly like I would, or like Theodore Beezer or the King James translators. He's in it. Dean Burgon, Hoskier, Miller, Scrivener, these guys, they had enough bullets to come against the Westcott and Hort nonsense of their day, but they were not TR people. They had some agreement in many places, but at the end of the day, if you said, okay, is this scripture? If I got any verse of the TR, is this scripture? Is this scripture? Many times they'd be saying, no, we don't believe that's scripture. And so what am I supposed to call these people? So the majority text movement was birthed out of that. Then, through Hoskier. And then you have, and even though Hoskier talks about the TR, he says, oh, the TR can be defended and things like that, but he's not defending every word of the TR. Absolutely not. He's coming against the TR in many places because he's working off the works of Burgon. And then you have the movement, you sort of got this group, like say Jay Green in his big interlinear here. Now, I know that I'm a small little dot on the page. You might be able to zoom in there. But at the back of his Greek and Hebrew interlinear, he has a whole bunch of verses and where they should be changed, because the majority text, these are majority text notes and how to use them. So the majority text says this, or the TR says this, majority text says this, that should be changed. And so this was in 1976, and so after a while, in the 1980s, you had like Hodges and Farstead, they were the main guys behind the New King James. They made a book called the majority text, basically, and then you had other guys, Robinson, Pierpont, other people involved with the majority text movement, Pickering, and so it became like a movement. It's like, okay, the majority text. Now, what you got to understand is that the Textus Receptus was called the majority text up until around that time, and so the majority text, it was just a name for it. It's like saying the English Bible for the King James back in the day. Well, now you probably couldn't use that because there's so many different English Bibles, and so things changed, names changed. So the majority text used to be, okay, Textus Receptus, because most of the readings are based on the majority. When they're not, usually there's internal evidence, grammatical issues, solecisms, internal things that show that's what the reading should be. Things like we're talking about here with homoioteliton, etc. And so the majority text movement started, and a printed text called the majority text came out. And so when the majority text came out, then people started going, hang on, the majority text doesn't back up with the King James, but the King James is supposed to be based on the majority text. Well, of course, it changed names. So just like if I said, I believe in the gospel message, the message is what will change lives, the message, and then they bring out a Bible called the Message Bible later on. It doesn't mean that they're synonymous. Obviously, you've got to draw a line between them. And so that's what's happened is, the King James is based on the majority text defined as the Textus Receptus back in the day. And so now the majority text is something completely different. It's been redefined. It's basically a Byzantine thing based upon the research of Caspar René Gregory and his compilation of 400 Byzantine manuscripts. And so, and there's several editions of the majority text. I think there's 3 different main editions, and these differ from each other. And the thing is, too, there's hardly any translations based upon the majority text. I think the WEB Bible is, and they just, it's all over the place with what they want in and out. And so, which majority text is it? And that's just a name. So people get confused. And it's like, oh, the King James isn't based on the majority text. Yeah, on the 1980s printed one or the 1990s one or the one printed the other day. It's like, of course not. That was a name of the TR. And so I'm just going to rewind back a tiny bit and we'll listen to what Jan says. So where are we? We're at 252. We'll go back to here and we'll just see what he says. And when he mentions the majority text, you'll notice that he will say, that Erasmus departs from the majority text. What today is majority text? It's just sort of like error upon error upon error. A mindset of like, oh, the King James isn't based on the majority text. Oh, no. It's like, well, yeah, of course, not that majority text. The other one. The TR used to be called the Greek Vulgate, the Complutensian text, the Syriac text, a whole bunch of things that probably today that they could be, those names could be a bit more beneficial to talk about other things, but back then that's what they were named. And so that's got to be taken into consideration. So anyway, I'll just clean up the thing of Matthew Rose because I mentioned it at the beginning. I mentioned it before. So with Scrivener, he was saying that Scrivener, basically wasn't a critical text guy. But how can you get a critical text? How can you get anything that like there was no majority text movement back then? What he's saying to delete all these words out of the Bible. He's saying throw this word out. Don't support that one. And so he's obviously not supporting the TR. So what is he supporting? He's working for Westcott and Hort. He's for their translation committee. And just because he made a TR doesn't mean he was supportive of that TR. And unfortunately, someone like D.A. Waite, he's named his institution the Dean Burgon Society, which I think was probably a rash thing to do. I think in the 1970s, they were probably reading Dean Burgon stuff and going, wow, this is really good stuff against Westcott and Hort. And it's scholarly and the rest of it. But then you keep reading and it's like, well, I'm not supporting the Textus Receptus, but they are supporting the Textus Receptus. So there's a divide there. And so probably would have been best if D.A. Waite called his society the Textus Receptus Society or something like that, or the King James Bible Society or something. But the Dean Burgon Society, it's sort of like, okay, we'll focus on Dean Burgon then. It's like, well, he's actually promoting the traditional text. And so that's the thing. If I say Dean Burgon wasn't a TR guy, no one really loses their mind. But if I say Scrivener wasn't a TR guy, he was more like a critical text guy because he worked for Westcott Hort and wanted to throw out a whole bunch of words and all the rest of it. Matthew Rose is like, oh, you can't prove that. You've got no evidence for that. Well, and the thing is with Matthew Rose, I've gone at loggerheads with him on Facebook, and almost everything I've said, he just turns it upside down and says the opposite. So it just gets to the point where I'm just like, whatever. He's just like, I'm just going to come against these people, and he's got really no knowledge and in a lot of things, and he just says bizarre things, and so I was just like, whatever, man, go fishing, go relax, take it easy. So I thought I'd mention that. Anyway, let's look at what Cran says about the majority text here.
Not only in the well-known case of Revelations 22:16-21, where minuscule 2814 is defective, but at many other places as well. And third, in printing, the typesetters made some errors that were not always detected in time. As a result, the Greek text of Revelation in the 1516 edition diverges from the majority text, which itself in Revelation is often split, at a great many places, and even from the Andreas text. Also because...
So, because it's just all these errors, it separates from the majority text. I mean, for a Textus Receptus person, majority text doesn't really mean that much. It's just another, it's like critical text light. It's like just assuming that the Greek Orthodox Church kept the Bible pristine in their transmission, where we believe that, there were some things that dropped out or got crept in. And it's like we can look at Latin, we can look at the three closed class of witnesses. You have the Greek primarily, and you have the Latin, and then you have the early church writings and commentaries and things like that. And so the Greek is first, that corrects the Latin. The Latin polishes the Greek, but they're guided by the commentary writers of the church leaders and church writers. And so we see them commenting on things, and many times these commentaries were brought through the ages. And sometimes you'll see in the commentary, it's different to what's in the biblical text. And so that's where we know there's been a change, either the commentary has been changed or the text has been changed, but that gives good indication of like, oh, something's wrong there. So,
minuscule 2814 itself has its share of readings in which it stands alone or only in the company of a few other manuscripts.
Okay, so he's saying the codex that Erasmus used, it's got its own unique type of readings in it. And so
it contains even many completely unattested readings. The Textus Receptus of Revelation is derived from this strangely mixed 1516 text.
So notice this compilation of like, okay, so you have Erasmus getting someone else to do an extraction of the text, making mistakes, then Erasmus probably making mistakes, then someone else has probably corrected that later. So it's like these other things, even in later editions, even things might have been corrected, but who knows who did that sort of thing. And then it's like, okay, the source itself, it's like, well, the text of Erasmus, it differs from the majority text, and he's talking about the 1980s majority text, which is not the majority text. It's based on 400 manuscripts of Caspar Rene Gregory. But even if we were to compile the majority, it's like, well, Textus Receptus, I mean, just go through Erasmus, go through Beza. Yes, they're looking at Greek and they're looking for readings in Greek, but we're also looking at things in Latin that polish the Greek, or even in outside of the closed class of witnesses, things like in Syriac. Tremelius and Janius, they were contemporaries with Theodore Beza. Those three guys worked on a Latin manuscript that was for about 300 years the most prominent Latin manuscript or printed edition of the Latin for Protestants. And so they worked on that as well. And so they knew these other languages. And even if you look here, you can see he's like, he's looked at Origen, Chrysostom, Cyril, Vulgari, I think that's Jerome, Cyprian. He's saying we've looked at these early church writers and we're comparing the Latin, we're comparing the Greek, we're comparing, and the thing is too, that many of these early church writers, they were fluent in Greek and Latin. There's the whole thing of trying to pit the Greeks against the Latins, even though their countries are right next to each other. And a lot of the time, you see in the Byzantine era, that they're basically similar. That they have similar beliefs and teachings and all the rest of it. And a lot of the time, they're translating things into Greek and Latin. parallel things. And so they like to make out there's this great wall of China between them. The Greeks and the Latins, they're all different and all the rest of it. And that's just another layer of, the banana peel scenarios. But yes, there are differences, and we've got to acknowledge that, but sometimes they can be blown out of proportion too.
Which combines particular readings of minuscule 2814, errors made in its transcription, Erasmian interventions, including retranslations, and printing errors. Erasmus editions were widely accepted and used. In the case of Revelation, later transcription, the Receptus of Revelation is derived.
So just listen to the amount of banana peel instances. This is the bad roots of the Textus Receptus.
From this strangely mixed 1516 text, which combines particular readings of minuscule 2814, errors made in its transcription, Erasmian interventions, including retranslations, and printing errors. Erasmus editions were widely accepted and used. In the case of Revelation, later editors, such as Stephanus and Beza, could not be aware of the shaky foundation of its Erasmian text. They had no good overview of the stock of existing readings and naively but understandably assumed that Erasmus would have followed a good manuscript throughout.
So they followed blindly. The later editions that came out, Stephanus and Beza, they blindly followed Erasmus, just thinking, well, he did a good job, and like as if they didn't check these things and question these things. Or the Complutensian Polyglot, it came out, the Collins Bible came out, the Wolf edition came out, the Aldine, but they say the Aldine is just Erasmus's text. And Stephanus was pretty clear. He had an apparatus there of, I think it was 16 different manuscripts that he was looking at in the Greek there, or 16 different sources, because some of them were like the Complutensian, which is a whole bunch of sources. And then there was other things. And then we look at Beza, and Beza clearly talks about, things of Erasmus and that type of nature. And so it just sort of amazes me that no one picked up on this type of issue until they rediscovered this manuscript, which goes against what Erasmus clearly said, that he saw this, homoetoiton with the biblos, the word for book, that he saw a few words were taken out, and he said there were only a few words, not 135 words of the last 6 verses. He said there were only a few, and he specifically pointed it to verse 19, and he said that's where the issue is. And it just seems like a stretch that that they've found this manuscript, and they're like, okay, well, let's just say now that we're going to compare Erasmus's text. Oh, it doesn't match up with this one. So Erasmus got it all wrong, and this is the correct text. Now, I understand that I could be proven wrong about this text. Perhaps it was the one that Erasmus used. I'm open to anything, okay? But the more I look at this, the more I study this gut intuition is just saying to me, no, Erasmus was telling the truth. The Reformation people weren't the Three Stooges, Stephanus and Beza just blindly followed along and just, slapping each other on the head and poking each other in the eye and doing the Three Stooges stuff, because they, you can't blame them. They're just copying Erasmus. They didn't know that Erasmus had slipped on 15 banana peels and got all these things wrong, and so they were just copying the errors, and that's what's in the King James today, and that's why we think these Textus Receptus King James people are dummies. And that's why we got the critical text, sort of thing. And so, to me, it's not gelling with what my view of reality is.
After all, Erasmus only hinted at the defects of the manuscript and his interventions at the final verses of the book, and then only in his first edition.
So what happened in the first edition, he said that he fixed a few words, And he only spoke about verse 19. Okay, so these guys are talking about from verse 16 to verse 21 were all back translated. So that's the main thing. They're saying Erasmus was lying.
Since, for the second edition, he mistakenly considered the problem to have been resolved.
So Erasmus in his first edition said, okay, this is the problem here. In his second edition of 1519, he mistakenly thought that he'd fixed the problem, so he crossed that out of his annotations. It didn't need to be in there. And it wasn't in his 1522, it wasn't in his 1527 or his final 1535 edition. And so what Erasmus was saying later on is that it needed to be corrected, that reading needed to be corrected from the Aldous edition. So that's where I'm weighing up whether it was the pre-printed Aldine edition or the 1518 edition itself. So that came out in 1518, a year before his Erasmus' second edition, 1519. So these are things that I'm weighing up.
Annotations on Revelation are few, and text-critical ones even more so. Only gradually did the specific nature of this text become known in the history of scholarship, partly because minuscule 2814 was lost for a long time, while Wettstein and Bengel in the 1730s suspected the true cause of many of the unattested readings. Delitzsch and Tregelles.
Okay, so Wettstein and Bengel, so in the 1730s, so this is like 130 years before this manuscript is rediscovered, if it is the manuscript. They've already come up with a whole bunch of things that Erasmus has done this and done that, and he's lied about this, and so they've already got this story, but just needs sort of like this manuscript to fill the holes of this story, sort of thing. They've already sort of created a very a lot of distrust in Erasmus by going through these things and saying, look, Erasmus, he wasn't honest about these things, and they're sort of making up a lot of things, saying that he back translated from the Latin instead of, no, he saw homoiouton in the Greek, and from the Latin you can clearly see that, like I was saying about John 3:16. I mean, you just know it's there. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son. If you had, for God so loved the world, whosoever believes in him, and he gave his only begotten Son was taken out. You instinctively know that. Even Dan Wallace, text critic, he says if you saw, the Constitution of the United States and it had in the preamble, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect onion, you just know instinctively that should be union. It's like, that's a given. And it's not like this is the first time Erasmus has ever read a book of Revelation, in Greek, or these guys would have been constantly reading Greek and Latin and German and English and Italian, and that they were going through these things. And later on, Jan, he sort of says that Erasmus wasn't a polyglot. Okay. That might be in another video, actually, but let's continue.
In the 1860s, could demonstrate the process in much more detail once minuscule 2814 had resurfaced and had been identified as the manuscript used by Erasmus.
Okay, so we got Bengel and Wettstein in the 1730s just creating all this stuff about Erasmus, saying it's not trustworthy, he's back translated from the Latin, this is something that he shouldn't have done. We think that he's done this a lot all the way through the Bible, through the book of Revelation, of course, but everywhere else in the Bible, he's just making up things out of thin air. And then later on, you've got Tregelles and you've got Delitzsch. So Delitzsch, he found the manuscript, and then Tregelles, he sort of popularized the concepts behind that. And so, and he because Delitzsch was German, he wrote a book, the Handschriften, probably said it wrong, but Tregelles has a section in there in English where he talks about that. And so we're going to probably, might even go through and read that online, or I'll probably just chuck it into an audio player. It's a little bit better than listening to me. I'm an R when I'm really tired. So yeah, so that's the eras. So we're going to go through those 1730s, Bengal, Whetstone, and then we're going to look at later on Delitzsch and Tregelles and what they their conclusions they came up with when this manuscript was rediscovered. So yeah, let's continue.
Their studies have now been corrected, complemented, and virtually completed by Andrew Brown. I have the book here, who published in 2013 the Erasmian text of Revelation with extensive notes on each reading.
So I don't have the work of Andrew Brown. I would love for someone to send me a copy, but it's $400. I was looking the other day. I was like, maybe I should just buy this thing. It's like $400. I'm like, oh. And so people are sending me little snippets and readings, and I'm finding, on academia, there's a few, people are quoting him, and so I'm getting little snippets here and there. But it would be great to have that whole work. I better plug my computer in. I think I'm going dead there. There we go. Yeah, so let's just continue.
Especially Brown's work should henceforth be compulsory reading for anyone who wishes to contribute anything on the subject.
Okay, so I do wish to contribute towards this subject, and so I will get Brown, go through it. But at the moment, we're just going to look at Jan Kranz's material, and then we're going to sort of branch off into studies of source material and things like that. And if in the meanwhile I do get somehow my hand on Michael Brown's material to study it, maybe I said Michael Brown, maybe even Andrew Brown, maybe I can even contact him because he used to be a Trinitarian Bible Society guy. He might say, cool, no worries, I'll give you he might even give me a whole bunch of stuff that if I tell him what I'm doing or show him these videos, he might even say, well, I like where you're going with these studies. Here, have my groundwork on that. He might even throw me a whole bunch of PDFs and stuff that he's using. So anyway, but yeah, that'll be interesting.
Even though, of course, some points of Brown's presentation and interpretation of the data can be debated. The following 10 facts are known.
So Brown used to work for the Trinitarian Bible Society. When he was in there, he was like a majority text sort of guy. People were getting tired of that, and they were critiquing him a lot. And so he basically has become an independent scholar now. So when Jan Kranz is saying there's some things that are debatable in that, one of the things would be that how he translates things. He tends to translate, like say Erica Rummel has said, Erasmus got someone else to extrapolate the text out of the commentary, where Brown seems to say we extrapolated it. So Erasmus is including himself in that. And the Christian Hospitality page, the Great Bible Text Fraud, they translate that in the same way. And so it's like that would probably be just one thing that Kranz would disagree with. Okay, so here we go, the 10 facts. And so this might actually line up with Timothy Berg's facts that he put the other day. But anyway.
What should be known about the 1516 Greek text. Erasmus used a single Greek manuscript for producing it, borrowed from Reuchlin.
So the Christian Hospitality page that I've gotten quite a lot of interesting ideas from, they contest that and say that he had many manuscripts, because he does use the plural. He says Greek manuscripts, plural. And so and that's specifically dealing with Revelation chapter 22. When he's talking in his annotations, he's talking about they looked at the Greek manuscripts. And so, but then when Erasmus is talking about the specifics of how he looked at this text of what he got from Reuchlin, or he has another guy called John Capito, I think it is. So I've got to understand, who these other guys are, or if that's another name for Reuchlin, or I think they're separate people. But is that a different manuscript? So Erasmus said, "Oh, we only have one manuscript at that time," and he does mention Reuchlin, and he took the text out of that, and he said, "We only have one manuscript at the time, and so I back translated that from the Latin, etc." So it just seems it's very confusing to know where to slot this timeline. But these are the issues that I'm going through and trying to work on. So, but Erasmus did say that he had at one point only one Greek manuscript. Now, whether that was when he was trying to fix the codex that Reuchlin had lent him, or whether it was talking about the printed, what was printed there, whether you have one, I'm still yet to figure that out. It's still all open to me. So any correspondence, any comments are all welcome.
He did not have another Greek manuscript at his disposal during the production stage.
Okay, so I guess it's sort of very similar to the first one, but why does he mention the plural Greek manuscripts? And how can you spot homoioteliaton in Revelation chapter 22, verse 19, unless the whole thing is that they say that he was lying about that, or just making it up, or it was just sort of like a convenient story to come up with, just an average sort of story, like, oh, it's probably homoioteliaton in that spot, and just sort of fudged over it when he was talking to Lee.
The manuscript was a commentary manuscript with biblical text and commentary interwoven.
Agreed.
An assistant produced an intermediate manuscript with the biblical text excerpted from the commentary.
An assistant, or Erasmus and an assistant. So, and that can make a big point when, and that's one of the reasons I asked Timothy Berg about that. It's like, how do you know it was just this? And it was just it's just one of those, because even in this, I've asked so many questions so far. I just said to Timothy Berg, how do you know that? And he wrote out a whole bunch of stuff. And I was like, oh, I was pretty grateful to be able to just throw that straight into my web page and just sort of cut out what he was saying, and just put the quotations. But yeah, obviously there is a difference between Rummel's text, Christian Hospitality, and even Brown. And see, the thing is, the Christian Hospitality website, a lot of people would go, well, that's just some TR guy. How can you trust him, sort of thing. But when you go, okay, it's Andrew Brown, well, he's a TR, Trinitarian Bible Society guy, so, but he's obviously come away from that type of thing. But so he can be trusted because he's on their side. But then Rummel's saying something different, and so that's the thing. These guys are saying different things among themselves, and so we can't just trust what they're saying. We have to examine everything.
This intermediate manuscript is now lost.
Okay, so the one that got extrapolated by Erasmus and his assistant, or his assistant, depending on who you read, that manuscript is now lost. So that was the one I was saying on Facebook a while back, that perhaps that's the one that got back translated in that one, or yeah. So it's quite interesting that manuscript is around somewhere, or perhaps it's got, that would be an interesting one to try and hunt down and find. Maybe Erasmus mentions something about his books and manuscripts and where they ended up or whatever. So anyway.
Erasmus edited it before it was sent to the typesetters. He hardly consulted the original manuscript.
How does he know that? See, this is where the critical text guys are just, oh, let's just throw in number 7. He didn't even look at the thing. So you can imagine Erasmus just, just casually, like, Bruce or Kurt Aland just smoking a cigar there, doing smoke rings and getting a servant to, you go off and you do your thing and bring me back the manuscript, And then he brings back the manuscript. Oh, he hardly even looked at the thing. You know what I mean? It just doesn't fit in with the story. And that based on such flimsy evidence. Now, if there's more evidence that I'm not seeing, tell me, rebuke me, show me. But at the moment, I can't see that. And so I think Erasmus did look at the manuscript. I think he was working with, he read Greek fluently. He would have been with other people who read Greek, and they would have been going through it probably checking each other and saying, yeah, well, you've written this. Sorry, that's wrong. This is wrong, this is correct or whatever. It just seems like number 7 just seems like it's just a Bart Ehrman-ish type of thing to throw in there. He hardly consulted the original manuscript,
Valla's annotations provided some readings, but more substantial readings are Erasmus' retranslations from the Vulgate.
Okay, so sometimes it can go back to Valla, and they can look at Valla and what he's saying. But see, because the whole story is you have only the manuscript that's been found by Delitzsch. Okay, so 300 years after Erasmus, they found this manuscript, and it's like, okay, how does that compare to Erasmus? Like, well, it's changed here and here and here and here. And then so they're going, okay, what else did he have? Well, he said he had Valla. So then they know, okay, well, let's look at all where Valla's changes are. And it's like, well, sometimes he goes with it, sometimes he doesn't. And then it's like, okay, well, and the other ones are from the Vulgate. So he not only did the last little bit from the Vulgate, but he did it all the way through the book of Revelation. Anywhere there's a deviation from that manuscript that they found has to be Vulgate, and so it's, look at that change. Look at this. It's agreeing with the Vulgate. And so basically Erasmus back translated. I mean, if that was part of what Erasmus wanted to do, if he could just back translate pretty much wherever he thought he wanted to in the book of Revelation, why didn't he just do that as his excuse for 1 John 5:7? Why is there a whole thing about he needed this Greek manuscript to appear, and all these anecdotes behind that, which is a lot of it's from Kranz and his guys over there as well. And it's like he could have just said, okay, it's in the Latin Vulgate. I just back translated that. But he didn't. And so it makes that suspect too. Oh, he's lying. He's lying and saying that he needs a Greek manuscript. He was just going, it's in the Latin. Let's just throw it in there. You know what I mean? And so it's just it comes totally against everything Erasmus was doing. His motivation, his character. He is painted as the villain. These guys are like the Scooby-Doo and the gang, and they've got Erasmus in the corner, and they've ripped off his mask. They're like, oh, you used the Vulgate, and you used maybe Valla, but you've back translated. We know what you've done, and we can prove it. Sort of thing, and that's why I'm questioning it. That's why I'm questioning all this, because it's just not, things aren't gelling. They're not fitting in even with other things like 1 John 5:7, where it's like he had to wait for a Greek manuscript.
And finally, the manuscript is nowadays known as minuscule 2814.
Okay, and what I'm seeing more and more, just going through this, because, obviously I've gone through this video quite a number of times. When it first came out, I went through it, but things weren't as concrete in my mind as they are now. But I was quite confused about where he was going with a lot of this. But now I'm realizing that they're accusing him of all these things, and they're doubting what he originally said. And so it doesn't really matter what Erasmus said anyway, because I was looking up what Erasmus said. I'm like, but he says this and he says that. And why aren't they reading that? And why aren't they looking at this? And then I'm realizing, oh, they don't care what he said. That's all in the bin. It doesn't matter what he's a liar or he's a Joe Biden guy. Ah, now it makes sense. Yeah, that was my epiphany. It was like, oh, these guys don't care what the original source documents say if Erasmus has just lied, you know. But then we've got the last one. The manuscript is nowadays known as 2814. That's where I've got That's probably where I've got to work on and see 100% if this is the manuscript. And so I know a lot of work's been done by people, and I'm really thankful to guys. You know, some of you guys might even be watching this, but a lot of people have sent me information, and they're, you know, people have just even opened up their Google Drive for me, saying, "Look at all this information that I've done on 2814. This is my thing on Erasmus. This is my thing on, you know, other verses where they're talking about these type of things." And so I'm able to, you know, I don't have to re-dig a whole bunch of wells. There is a lot of digging to do, but thankfully, you know, people coming alongside saying, "I've already dug this hole here, 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 and here," and I'm able to go through their material, summarize it, and then when I'm going through my material, I'll be able to bounce back on their thoughts and their studies. And so, but one of the main things I guess I'm going to have to go through is probably the main thing is 2814 the manuscript that Erasmus used. And my gut feeling, I have a tiny bit of proof for this, but my gut feeling is that there were several manuscripts of this. Probably Reuchlin may have owned some of these things, and perhaps he gave Erasmus another edition of that. That's not beyond the realms of possibility. We might even still be able to find that manuscript somewhere. So I know, say Hoskia, he's done a whole bunch of work on that, but Hoskia believes this. So this is the thing. I'm not just saying, okay, this is just critical text, guys, blah, blah, blah. I'm saying pretty much most people believe this story. And when you get to a lot of scholars on the TR side, they sort of go, well, God providentially used the Latin to restore the Greek here, sort of thing. And it's, I'm to me, I just like, you know, I can take a faith thing and just go, because I believe the Word of God has to be somewhere. And the more I look at the critical text, I'm just like almost vomiting every time I look at it. Like, that's just disgusting. No, that's a mistake. No, that's the wrong genealogy. No, that's the wrong history. No, that contradicts the Old Testament. No, that contradicts the New Testament. No, and I just see errors all through it. And so for someone to come along and say, see, this last thing is critical text guys like this is the true story. I'm just like, sorry, man, I've just been through this so many times. I've just, you know, if you're the cop and you've listened to so many crackhead stories, you stop believing them after a while. And you're like, you're starting to see through it. And you're starting to see a bigger picture of, you know, of deception, people just being deceived and being deceived. Not only are they deceiving, but they're being deceived. And so someone like Bruce Metzger saying that, you know, the genealogical errors in St. Atticus and Vaticanus were made by Matthew in the originals. He got the genealogies wrong. To me, that's heretical. And so, you know, unfortunately, people are just following these things. Anyway, I want to at least get to the 10-minute mark because we've still got lots to go. But he throws all these facts in and then he stretches it out. And so hopefully we can get through.
Well, how do we know all this? Well, we go to the sources, of course, ad fontes. Primary sources for studying the 1516 Erasmian text of Revelation are, it's very logical, the following: the text of the 1516 edition itself.
Yep, so if you go to my website, tr.org.au, you can see I've got the 1516, 1519, 22, 27, and 35, and you can see that it's only really 1516 that has that original saying in it. But as I was mentioning in my last video, there's lots of things I can do. Even when something is taken out like that, you can still go through the rest of the annotations and see similar words or similar instances. And so these are things that are going to be examined.
And Erasmus annotations. And, very important, scattered remarks made by Erasmus in letters and apologies. And for, of course, very important, minuscule 2814 itself. And additional sources are the Vulgate text and Waller's annotations. And there are indeed a number of explicit statements by Erasmus himself, which we could call the external evidence. And there are comparisons that can be made between the 1516 Greek text and minuscule 2814 and other information. And then you see the exact nature of the Erasmian interventions. And that can be seen as the internal evidence. But I will focus mainly on the external evidence. In 1520, Erasmus wrote against Lee, one of his critics, at the end of Revelation, in the only copy that we then had, for the book is rarely found in Greek. Well, and here you see the reference in the Latin tum, called tum nobis erat unicum, is to the time of production of the 1516 edition, and to Revelation, not the final verses, but the entire book. In 1521, he wrote against another critic, Stonica. In Revelation, we had only a single manuscript at our disposal, but a very old one, supplied by the exceptional hero of letters, Johannes Reuchlin. Again, the reference is to 1514, 1516.
So it's interesting that he says Johannes Reuchlin is an exceptional hero of letters. So he's collecting these type of volumes. And so maybe he's collecting them to print them or just out of curiosity. But that would have been like, say, when people compiled manuscripts, oftentimes they became experts at those. So when we look at, say, Henry Saville with the King James, he was a King James translator. He had Lancelot Andrews and John Boyce working with him, and they compiled the complete works of Chrysostom. And so this was all in Greek. Now, he had over 15,000 manuscript sheets, and he would travel Europe looking for the works of Chrysostom and buying them. So he had a huge library. So he was actually buying them from libraries and colleges and from manuscript owners and probably Reuchlin, people of that ilk. The obviously not Reuchlin himself, but from his library later on, and so yeah, he compiled 15,000 manuscript sheets. And so, if I was to say that I borrowed a certain book of Chrysostom from Henry Saville, it's not just like, okay, that's the only one he's got, and you wouldn't expect that. Say even Aldous, who Erasmus was proofreading for, and who basically, there's a really good YouTube video. If you just type in Aldous Malnucius into YouTube, you find very, very good and interesting information about him. He's a brilliant guy. He's like just an unsung hero of that whole era. But he was doing he was printing a lot of Greek work that would have just faded away into history had he not compiled lots of manuscripts. And so he would have compiled, if he was doing something like the Odyssey, 10, 15 manuscripts of that to compare and to go through and to correct and then put it into print. And so I'm not sure about Reuchlin, what his motivations were, but usually if you've got one of something, then you're interested in other copies of it as well. And so perhaps, the 2814 manuscript that they're saying is the one that Erasmus used and Delitzsch found in the 1860s. perhaps that's not the one. Perhaps Reuchlin had several. Perhaps he had 20 copies of this. That's something that I've got to look into. Maybe he only had one. So that's where I've got to look into these things.
And it contains the important clue that the manuscript came from Reuchlin. In 1520, in a later apology against Lee, he wrote, "Because the book of the Apocalypse never found much favor with the Greeks, it is there among them. Hence, since I did not want anything to be missing from our edition, I extracted with some difficulty a very old codex containing commentaries on this work from the famous scholar Johann Reuchlin." The codex, not the commentaries, of course. From it, I had the words of the text copied out. Well, here he states the provenance, the fact that it was a commentary manuscript, and that what he had done to separate text and commentary. It must have been necessary to do.
So notice this is from Erica Rummel. From it, I had the words of the text copied out. And so that's where Andrew Brown has, from it, we extracted the words of the commentary, and Christian Hospitality. So it has we, where this is Rummel's, and he says, from it, I had the words of the text. So I commanded it to go forward, sort of thing, and so that's where you have that other person, doing the job, giving it to Erasmus. Erasmus hardly even looked at it, and then he gave it to his printers, and just this comedy of errors.
Do so, for typesetters would not have been able to work with such a manuscript itself. Brown.
And that's a good point. And so if this was, so say the typesetters, they needed as little clutter as possible. And so when they extracted the text from the commentary, that put it into certain lines and all the rest of it, so that they could measure out how many quires they needed for the printing of it. So if you've got your book, and so you've got a certain amount of quires, a quire is sort of like where you have it folded in a certain way, and you stack the quires on top of each other, and that creates the book. But it's pretty hard to figure that type of thing out if you've got a commentary all in the middle of it. They would have had to have done this work. So, but I'm pretty sure it was Erasmus and another guy, an assistant, or perhaps several assistants who worked on this already, just so that the printers don't have this thing. It's like, man, we've got all this commentary to read through, and so that's why he would have had to create his own manuscript on that. So that's something that we need to think about too, is that he had a manuscript that was intermediate. That was, you had the Reuchlin one that he had, whether it was this 2814 we're going to look at, but then he created his own manuscript on it, and he worked on that and corrected the homoiouton issue at Revelation chapter 22 verse 19, and then that was given to the printers. Now, whether it was the only manuscript he had at that time when he was creating that manuscript, or whether it was when it was at the printers they only had one copy of Revelation, we've got to work through that. And so I've got to work through that.
Things that Erasmus had a copy made because he had promised to Reuchlin that he would return the manuscript untouched. But I do not think Erasmus would have had such scruples.
So he said, I had to copy it out because I had to give the manuscript back. But then he's like, well, I don't think Erasmus really cared about that. Okay, so you just borrow a manuscript of someone, you don't return it. It's just a stab at Erasmus. But if you think that he's really going to lie about all this sort of stuff, as we're going to see, then you just think that Erasmus is just an idiot. And this is the type of thing that they want you to think, that Erasmus is just a bumbling idiot.
We know from his letters that he indeed asked Reuchlin for a New Testament manuscript. At the time, the precise plans for the 1516 edition will be made around September 1514.
September 1514. So that's an interesting date to think about.
The request itself is not specific, and Erasmus also received minuscule 1 from Reuchlin. And in June 1516,
so from Reuchlin, he also received Minuscule 1, which Minuscule 1 is Gospels, I'm pretty sure. I think it's actually quite a large New Testament manuscript, just going from memory. I've got a thing about Minuscule 1 on my website. So he also borrowed that from Reuchlin. So he's borrowing a whole bunch of stuff from Reuchlin. You know, well, two that we know of, and that Kranz is talking about.
Reuchlin mentioned that a manuscript had been returned to him, which must refer to Minuscule 1, because 2814 was never returned to Reuchlin.
Well, and see, that's the thing. It seems to be going against the story. Erasmus is saying that he did a copy, and so that he could return to Reuchlin. Reuchlin's like, okay, I got a manuscript back, and he's saying, well, it can't have been the Revelation one. It had to have been this other Gospels one, because we know that later on they found this other manuscript that Delitzsch had in the 1861. So it's going against the story as well, like as if Reuchlin was like happy just getting the one manuscript back. It's like, oh, Erasmus, he can do whatever, he can keep it, you know. It's like, no, he said he was going to return it, and even later on, he's like, no, he's talking about how he wanted to return it and things like that, and so it's like, I just don't see why that's disbelieved, and why would Erasmus want to keep it? And it's like, oh, it was never returned because we found this other manuscript. Well, how about it was returned and this other manuscript isn't the one that Erasmus used? That could make sense too. And, you know, I know that some people would be like, oh, you're just a TR guy, you're desperate, blah, blah, blah. No, this is thinking outside of their box. They've created a box, and I'm thinking outside of it, going, when I look inside your box, it's a mess. I'm not saying that I have my own little box here. I've figured it all out, but I'm looking at your box, and I don't think you figured it out either. And questioning what you're saying.
Against both Lee and Stunica, Erasmus, as we see, calls the manuscript very old. Well, such remarks must be seen as almost standard propaganda, and it is typical.
No, he clearly says that it's old in a sense where it's an old commentary, and that the text goes back to 200 to I mentioned his name earlier, but I can't. Anyway, so it goes back to 200. So we it's not like, this is an old manuscript. It's what's on it. It's the commentary. You know, if you've got just say, you know, the rapture doesn't happen for another 200 years or 2,000 years, and I'm like, okay, we're reading Adam Clark's commentary here, and I'm like, okay, that's old. I'm not saying the Bible text that's with it is of the same age. That might be modern, but the commentary is old. So that's what Erasmus was alluding to. This is an old commentary of Revelation. So that would be actually a very interesting manuscript to go through, because you would get a good grasp of what the early church thought about the book of Revelation and their theology and their eschatology, which would be quite interesting. So anyway.
That they occur in Apologies. And I have another example for you. In the 1527 edition, he says, let no one condemn our copy, so the manuscript that the manuscript that we use, for it was of such great age that it might be thought to have been written in the time of the apostles. Well, Bengal in 70.
So, but that's talking about the the text of the commentary. Yeah, not saying that, okay, this is like a papyri manuscript that the apostles use, and the thing is too, I'm not sure as I went through my last video, we looked at lots of Latin and the contradictory nature of people writing about Erasmus, of how one, Erica Rummel will contradict Kranz, and that'll contradict Andrew Brown, and it'll contradict the Christian hospitality page, and it's like, I'm just not sure if that's an accurate translation of the Latin, and so I've got to go through that myself.
34 was the first to point out, without even having seen the manuscript, that this is simply impossible for a commentary manuscript. Well, the fact of the Erasmus retranslation can also be demonstrated from Erasmus's own work.
So they're saying, okay, this is really silly because it's a commentary manuscript. How can that go back to the time of the apostles? It's a commentary, and saying it's really stupid. Well, obviously, he's talking about the age of when the commentary was written. I mean, that's I give people the benefit of the doubt. I'll even try and give Kranz and other people the benefit of the doubt, but give Erasmus the benefit of the doubt that he's talking about that this old commentary went right back to like 200, and so you're looking at 100 years after the last apostle apparently died. So I'd say about 96. That seems to be a number that just keeps popping up. Where John wrote Revelation, and not long after that he's passed away. And so, but yeah, 100 years later. And so when he's talking about the time of the apostles, well, was this oral, or was it, were these concepts taught by the apostles and then written down in year 200? That would be what Erasmus is talking about, So I just think this is just, they've found something. It's like, look at what he says here, how dumb. He's trying to say that it goes back to what the apostles wrote that manuscript. And then let's just go through that section again and just listen to how Kranz talks about it.
1, because 2814 was never returned to Russian. Against both Lee and Stunica, Erasmus, as we see, calls the manuscript very old. Well, such remarks must be seen as almost standard propaganda, and it is typical that they occur in apologies. And I have another example for you. In the 1527 edition, he says, "Let no one condemn our copy," so the manuscript that the manuscript that we use, "for it was of such great age that it might be thought to have been written in the time of the apostles." Well, Bengal in 1734 was the first to point out, without even having seen the manuscript, that this is simply impossible for a commentary manuscript. Well,
so it's just like, it's Bengal's like read that and said, hey, he's saying it comes from the apostles. It's like, I wouldn't, if I read through that and I was going through, if that was translated into English, and I just went, okay, it was thought to have been written in the time of the apostles, but that's where I've got to look at the translation of all that. I would say, oh, well, Erasmus is saying that this could be the teaching of the apostles, and like 100 years later, it was written down, and then that's the commentary. So he's saying that it goes close to that time, the apostolic era.
The fact of the Erasmus retranslation can also be demonstrated from Erasmus's own words. He writes at the end of his 1516 annotation, "At the end of this book, I found some words in our Latin versions which were lacking in the Greek copies, but we added them from the Latin ones." He does not indicate, and that's important, the exact scope of his retranslation, for that is the only meaning that adding to the Greek from the Latin can have. And he downplays the issue by speaking about just some words. He also uses the plural Greek copies, but he can, of course, only refer to 2814. If he had.
You see what I'm saying? So these are Erasmus's original words, and from what I can gather, this is a good translation of it, because they all of the ones that I'm looking at that sometimes contradict each other, they all sort of agree in this point. And it's like at the end of the book, I found some words he's got Latin in commas there, in our versions, which were lacking in the Greek copies. And that's a major thing, where it's talking about in these words were lacking in the copies, plural. So then it's like, okay, Erasmus is saying he has more than one Greek copy. So that goes against the whole thing of, oh, you only have one manuscript. And so this is what Erasmus is saying. And this is in his annotations, 15, 16 annotations. So basically, Erasmus's edition was the Greek. And on one side, it was a diglot. So di just means two, divorces, split. So you got the Greek on one side, then you got the Latin on the other, and it's basically just on each page you got that. Then you have from Matthew to Revelation, and then you have on the back of that the annotations. So it's probably even bigger than the Bible, the New Testament itself. Just a whole bunch of stuff about talking about different readings and different reasonings of why the Latin says this, the Greek says this, but think about this type of doctrine and think about this internal evidence and this external evidence. And so it's going through all that sort of stuff. So this is right at the end, near the very end, and it's got this written in the 1516. And these red words aren't in any other edition from there because Erasmus said we've cleared that issue up. We don't need to put it in anymore. So he says, however, at the end of this book, I found some words in our Latin, or it's in brackets there, the Latin, so let's just leave that out. We found some words in our versions which were lacking in the Greek copies, plural. So, and we added them from the Latin ones. So Jan Kranz and Delitzsch, Tregelles, basically Tischendorf, Westcott and Hort, all the way through to all the scholars today are saying that matches up with the 6 missing verses on that manuscript. But when Erasmus was questioned by Lee about this, he says, oh no, it's only dealing with Revelation chapter 22 verse 19, one verse. And notice he says we found some words in our, like not a lot of words. And when you go through, you can tell that Erasmus's story doesn't change. He just expands on it more, and people questioned him more and said, how far did these Latin words extend? And he's like, well, if I spotted homoieteiton, I could have easily just worked in those words there, but I did it from the Latin because I knew that I could at least get an accurate representation of what those words said. So he didn't even feel like it was an addition. He just felt like he saw a gap there. And so this is one of the things too. I wonder if there's grammatical issues there and all the rest of it. But see, these guys don't even believe that this happened. They believe that the last 6 verses are totally missing. So he never saw this. He's vaguely said it here, and later on when he's questioned, he just made up more and more stories, and they just got more elaborate. And then he's hoping that no one busts him.
It had another Greek manuscript, there would have been no problem to begin with. Such imprecisions occur elsewhere as well, and they need not surprise us. Erasmus had no great interest in explaining what he had done to the Greek text of Revelation. As one of his critics was quick to point out, if he could correct the Greek text after the Latin, on what basis could he still be critical of the Vulgate? Why not correct the Greek in many more places? And he could have even gone further. Why did Erasmus have to have recourse to the Greek at all? Erasmus must have felt very well that the retranslations in Revelation would make his entire New Testament project vulnerable if widely known. And this one sentence...
So you see what I mean? So someone critiqued it and said, oh, he's apparently back translated the Latin here, and then they found this manuscript with 6 verses missing, and they're like, well, that's the one he used. That's the only one he used, So he did 6 verses, and he's been lying about it just being 1 verse. But people are like, well, if he can do a back translation of the Latin here, where else has he done that? He's done it everywhere else in the Bible. And so then it just becomes this whole mushroom of problems that these guys are saying happened.
Sentence in the 1516 edition on some words is indeed the only place in his annotation where Erasmus mentions retranslation. And it might even be asked why he included it in the first place. It seems...
Okay, so he's saying this is the only place where he actually even mentions this type of back translation sort of thing happening. But see, I would say Erasmus didn't like to say it was a back translation. He was saying that it was just fixing the hole that was in the text. So he saw that there were some missing words. He said there are only a few, and he specifically said it was Revelation chapter 22, verse 19. So he fixed it. So, like I was saying with John 3:16, it's like, well, I know that those words should be in there. So he corrected them, and so interesting.
It functions as the starting point of his general remarks on the book of Revelation. The rest of the annotation, the final one, on the entire New Testament, discusses style, authorship, and canonicity of the book. And we already saw a glimpse of this in the remarks against Lee. Erasmus notes that the book was disputed in the Greek tradition. He himself does not believe the book was written by the evangelist and relegates it to his second canonical rank, not only here, but in numerous writings from 15.
So this is one of the things where I pulled up crayons on this, because in Erica Rummel's writings, he says basically when he's talking to Lee in 1520, explaining this note, because Lee was, just to give you a bit of a rundown, if you haven't watched the first video, Lee was sort of like a critic from England. I think his father was the Lord Mayor, and he was friends with Erasmus, but then came against him really harshly about what he'd done. And he questioned him a lot about these type of issues. And Erasmus wrote back and printed back a whole bunch of stuff and sent it to him. And so Lee, in his response to Lee, Erasmus says that he used... I'm just going to rewind it just a tiny bit because I've sort of lost my train of thought, but it will get jogged back.
On the entire New Testament, discusses style, authorship, and canonicity of the book. And we already saw a glimpse of this in the remarks against Lee. Erasmus notes that the book was disputed in the Greek.
Okay, so Erasmus notes the books were disputed. Erica Rummel's writings, when you read through that, it basically says the books were disputed by the Greeks. So it's the book of Revelation, the Greeks, for whatever reason, might have gone against their traditional teachings or whatever, but for some reason they didn't like the book of Revelation. It's not like they completely rejected it, but it was a bit rare. And we see that in history, like say even Luther, he was like, all right, the book of James, I'm not sure about, things like that. So they just weren't sure about the book of Revelation. And so, but what Jan Kranz does is the word olim, that is in the response from Erasmus to Lee in his 1520, he translates it to mean that Erasmus thought that the authorship was unknown. So he didn't know whether it was John or he didn't know whether it was, and who wrote this book? That's what Erasmus thought, not what the Greeks had thought, that the authorship was once unknown. Jan Kranz makes it out that Erasmus was saying, I don't know who wrote it. And this is one of the things where Erasmus, I think there's 4 different things where he says at the beginning of the book of Revelation, sometimes it says John, the Apostle John, sometimes John the theologian, sometimes it says John this and John that. And it's like that this was questioned among the Greeks, like who wrote it, because sometimes there's 2 Johns, there's some people see John the Elder, like, in 2 John, it has ho presbyteros, which is the elder. They see that as someone different to the Apostle John. And so that has been historically, like, people just asking questions and things like that. And so Erasmus talks about it, but because of what these guys do with what we know about they're talking about, I've got to look into all that myself and just see exactly, where is that another anecdote or whatever. But from what I can understand is that is also proof that he had access to copies of Revelation in the Greek, because how does it have the difference of this is John the Apostle and this is John the theologian and things like that? So I'll just rewind it again and we'll just listen to Kranz, because he does, and this information here, even though I disagree with Kranz, it's interesting information, and I'm learning by going through this and having to say it back. I'm not just trying to squeeze a TR position in here. I'm trying to learn, and I'm trying to understand things, but I'm also being critical about what's being said with the limited knowledge that I have. Okay, so maybe we'll go back to here.
Would make his entire New Testament project vulnerable if widely known. And this one sentence in the 1516 edition on some words is indeed the only place in his annotation where Erasmus mentions retranslation. And it might even be asked why he included it in the first place. It seems it functions as the starting point of his general remarks on the book of Revelation. The rest of the annotation, the final one, on the entire New Testament, discusses style, authorship, and canonicity of the book. And we already saw a glimpse of this in the remarks against Lee. Erasmus notes that the book was disputed in the Greek tradition. He himself does not believe the book was written by the evangelist, and relegates it to his second canonical rank, not only here, but in numerous writings from 1516 till his death. This one admission of retranslation, however...
Okay, so he doesn't really go into the how Erasmus saw the titles of the Book of Revelation, but that's a whole other thing. There's so many things, man. What would be great is to just have a team of guys to go, okay, someone work on Revelation headings, and what Erasmus saw. Did he, he said he saw John the theologian, John the apostle perhaps, and which ones did he see, and go through that, go through the Greek and put it, Christian hospitality one, Kranz one, Andrew Brown one, Rummel, whoever else has done it in history, and just put it all there with the Latin. And so I can go, okay, bang, put it in my website, and then we can grow from there on just that one little issue. I mean, for me, that's like half a day of just going through a bunch of stuff and wading through stuff. But perhaps someone's already done a lot of that as well, and in a book somewhere. So perhaps Brown's already done it. I'm actually just going to jump to some questions here. Morph Wales says, I'm King James only, but have not got a problem with the Textus Receptus, as that's from the same lineage and are practically the same. And I think a lot of King James people and TR people many times don't recognize that there are two issues with the King James. It's a translation of the Greek and Hebrew, but it is also its own unique Greek and Hebrew. So it is its own. It's an English version of the Masoretic text and the Greek Textus Receptus, but it is its own unique edition of the Hebrew and the Greek. So not only did the translators translate, but they actually beforehand formulated their own Hebrew and their own Greek text and worked from those. And so that's got to be taken into consideration, and that's why they blur the whole issue and say, it's re-inspiration and all this stuff. It's like, no, they just got the works of Beza, and which was, almost completely there, and they just took it over the line, so it was spot on. And they were able to do that because there was enough scholars to go through and do that sort of work. You can do that in any language, but they were able to nail it. Now, had they done a parallel Hebrew and Greek Bible of their day, there would be no difference between the TR movement and the King James movement. But they only did it in English. And I think they purposely did that because it's sort of like now it's a bit like the Latin Vulgate. Now it's in Latin. Everyone look at the Latin. And so then they've got sort of the Latin language becomes strong. And that's what happened in English. It's like, well, that's where the Bible is. And so they're looking at the English. And that's why the King James is more than just a translation. And so I think once people know that, King James people and TR people tend to just gravitate together. And if you go to my website, tr.org.au, you'll see what David Cloud has written about Edward Hills and what he stated about where the Bible is. And so he's saying that it's in the authorized version. That's the final edition of the TR was the authorized version. And then he says specifically the Greek text underlying the authorized version. So they had a Greek text that they used and they all would have agreed on, or else how else would have they have sent it off to the other committees and they're like, hang on, this doesn't match up with the Stephanus or the Beza, or there's a difference here. Now there's only about 20 translatable differences between Scrivener's work and Beza. Yes, they had the King James. When Westcott and Hort were like, okay, well, we want a Greek text so we can compare our Greek text to the TR. Where did they go? They went to the King James. So they thought what I'm saying too, they thought that the King James wasn't just a translation of the Greek, it was its own edition. And they had to extract, basically it's like Beza's text except for like 20 readings. And they're so small that it's like, it's only when you get to this level of talking about the TR and all the rest of it that you realize, that it's very small amount of words, but it's enough for it to be its own edition of the TR. Just as much as you have different editions of Beza, well, the King James came along, it was its own edition. So that's where even like the Elzevir's comes after that, and it's considered a TR edition, or the TR, because it's the heading. But it's like, I don't go with that. I do go with Beza a lot, because it is close. The closest one is the Scrivener one, because it's sort of like Beza's text, and then in those other places it's retranslated back from the English into the Greek in those minute places. So yeah, interesting. B.E. Separate says, good morning from Florida. Blessings, Nick. Interesting that you're in the AM there. I'm in the PM. It's 11:27 on a Friday night here. How great was the Reformation that Erasmus and the King James Version are still a thorn in their side. Love it. Yes, it's so good. And the good thing is too, like most of us, we read the King James. It's so predictable. It hasn't changed for like 410 years. So it's not like we're just going to read something one day and go, oh, what's that? Like they do with the modern Bibles. It's like you read Galatians chapter 5, verse 12, and it's Paul wants people legalists to go and get a knife and, cut their privates off and things like that. It's like, oh, okay, that's different. I didn't know that was there. Okay, I guess I should hope for that too. I hope Seventh-day Adventists would, get the carving knife and chop. And just bizarre readings like that. Like we have a Bible that's so predictable, it's so stable, and the more people look at it, the more they admire it. And I think that's great that we have that. And look at this rich history that we have below the King James, And so we're just dealing with the first edition of Erasmus here and all the rest of it. But there was so much more that came along and so much evidence, and yeah, it's such a rich history. B. Separate says Crans mistakenly came to that conclusion. He then says the prices on some of these modern academic books is out of control. Imagine if Erasmus pulled those verses from a trash can. He would now be as revered as Tischendorf. Yes, and so yeah, about the academic books. Well, I wonder if I can get an ebook of that. I think they're deliberately not, because he apparently deals with 1 John 5:7 in that book as well, and also Revelation, and so that's why I guess it's a little bit more exclusive than other ones. And if you go to PDF Drive and just type in any book, I mean, there's almost everything there. People are just throwing everything up there, so it's quite interesting. But yeah, I think if that's the thing, when you look at Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, it's like that's where you really do have errors. So the problem is these guys are not looking in their own backyard at the bizarre things that Tischendorf was saying about how he acquired the manuscript. And even James White gets this totally wrong over and over and over, and doubles down on it, and about the whole trash can, concept. Oh, he didn't get it from a trash can; it was wrapped in a red linen thing. Well, why did he say that he got it from a trash can? He's obviously lying. So this is the thing: these guys have heroes like Tischendorf who they know lie. It's common. Like, it's just easily, like, if you had Tischendorf around today, he'd just say, "Okay, I lied." It's so obvious. But so they try to think that everyone's like that, and so they try to put that on Erasmus here and say, "Oh, he just lied. He just made stuff up." And it's like, not everyone is like that, and just because there's people who you admire, like Bruce Metzger or Bart Ehrman or whatever, just because people can be loose in certain things, it doesn't mean that that's how everyone is. It doesn't mean that Beza, just because you can't find a manuscript today that Beza was talking about, it doesn't mean he had a senior moment or made up something or tricked him. So, just reading those into those scenarios is disrespectful for their level of scholarship. These are world-leading experts. And I know today a world-leading expert is someone ridiculous like Richard Dawkins. You know what I mean? That he's Greta Thunberg, world-leading. It's be separate. And he supposedly went off memory with Vaticanus because they wouldn't allow notes. Yeah, so that was the story of him sitting in the Vatican Library with Vaticanus, and it's quite interesting that Vaticanus and Saint Atticus came through him, and he was there with the Pope, and it's just this amazing story. But there's so much that you could talk about with that era. And it's going to be fun going through this and going through and discovering what Bengal said, and also Tregelles and Delitzsch, and who was the other one? Whetstein. These guys, it's going to be fun finding out what these guys have said and things that they've claimed about Erasmus and all the rest of it. But it would be a fun journey going through following Tischendorf's life or something like that, and going through all the things that he said. And I really enjoyed it, like what Stephen Avery is doing with claiming that it's a modern day forgery, or claiming that it's basically been made in, I think, 1839 or 1840. It's just brought so much light to that whole thing, and just how much Tischendorf lies. It's quite interesting. Anyway, I'll just move on, and I'll probably only go for another 5 minutes. I'm just starting to get a little bit tired here.
Provoked criticism from his critics Lee and Stunica. In his answers to them, some details become clearer, but some others become more confused. And it can even be said that Erasmus, possibly being led astray by his own memory,
See, it can even be said of Erasmus, possibly being led astray by his own. Joe Biden, Erasmus is just like, and this is earlier on, 15, 16 edition, he writes a note, and then he's like, okay, we don't need that note anymore. And then 1519 comes around, 1520, he's writing stuff, 1521. So it's not that far detached from the time that he's looked at stuff and all the rest of it. But he's like Joe Biden, just staring at the ceiling. And he's tricked himself with his own memory.
At the beginning of a long history of confusion on the issue. And only Bengel and Whetstein in the 1730s started to suspect what had really happened. And even they, without having recourse to the manuscript, could not really gauge the general pattern. For this,
so Bengel and Whetstein. So Bengel predicted Jesus would come back in 1836. And so this is one of the things that would make a really good title or to a book, or just a theme. It's like, okay, so we've got this whole scholarly understanding of Erasmus, And it's not until a guy who predicted that Jesus would come back in 1836, until he came along and said, no, think about this, this, and this, about Erasmus, that we started to realize Erasmus was an idiot, and he had senior moments like Joe Biden.
For this reason, only Erasmus' treatment of the final verses has acquired a standard handbook anecdotal status, and not his dealings with the book as a whole. Okay.
Just going to rewind that a
The
little
manuscript
bit.
could not really gauge the general pattern. For this reason, only Erasmus' treatment of the final verses has acquired a standard handbook anecdotal status, and not his dealings with the book as a whole. Okay. There are some.
Okay, so, yeah, anyway, we'll just continue.
More places where he mentions retranslation. So here we go. Already in his first apology against Lee, he wrote, at the end of the Apocalypse, the manuscript I used, I had only one, you've seen that, was lacking one or two lines, verses. I added them following the Latin codices. They were of the kind that could be restored out of the preceding text. Thus, when I sent the revised copy to Basel, I wrote to my friends to restore the place out of the Aldine edition, for I had not yet bought that work.
And so when it says Aldine edition, that's one of the things where in the Latin it's just from Aldus, and so I think it should be here. Aldina. It does say edition there though. Editione. Ex editione Aldina, from the edition of Aldus. So yeah, there you go. I've proven myself wrong. But that, according to the Christian Hospitality guys, so I mistakenly thought that it had the Aldine there. But the Christian Hospitality guys, they basically say that the Aldine edition could have been the pre, because it was in 1516, so it could have been the draft, and then later on, Erasmus is talking about it, saying, "Well, I got them to fix it from that because I hadn't bought the edition." Pretty much saying because it hadn't come out yet, you hadn't printed it, so I got them to fix it from the Aldine edition, from the guys from Aldus, and so that's an interesting thought.
They did as I instructed them.
So notice that after absolutely everything, this is in 1520. He's saying that when I sent the revised copy to Basel, I wrote to my friends to restore that place out of the Aldine edition, for I had not yet bought that work. They did as I instructed them. So notice Erasmus is saying they did this. He's not saying I'm not sure if they did it or not. He's concretely saying they did as I instructed them. They did exactly what I wanted them to do. They restored the Latin readings with Greek from the Aldine.
Again, as we know, Erasmus downplays the size of his retranslation and also states that the missing lines were easily restored. There is some.
So, Crimes is saying he's downplaying the retranslation, saying it's 6 verses, because when they found that manuscript, there's 6 missing. When Erasmus is only claiming 1 here, 1 verse, he's downplaying it, saying it was lacking 1 or 2 lines. So notice in his other one, he said there were a few words. So notice 1 or 2 lines. That's not 135 words. This is why I'm questioning the whole thing. It's like there's the huge contradiction here. Erasmus is either just lying through his teeth here, and you imagine if he was lying, all of the people who worked with him could have easily just said, "Hey, hang on, sorry, Erasmus is lying here," or even Reuchlin could have just turned around and said he's lying. It just becomes this whole. They like to say, "Oh, King James only conspiracy theory." That becomes a conspiracy theory. They're making up this conspiracy, that Erasmus has, and he has to have all his printers be quiet. He has to have the guys from Aldus be quiet, about all this. You imagine the amount of problems that would have caused in that era. Imagine Aldus. Aldus passed away around the same time. I think it was 1517. But his sons took over that, and so imagine them writing to Erasmus. Hang on, you said to Lee this and this, but we back translated from here and here. How come you can do this? And or we used your edition of the Greek for our 1518, and you're saying you got it from us. It has to be a conspiracy, because the Aldous guys have to shut their mouth. The guys from Basel, the printers, have to shut their mouth. The guys who helped him extrapolate that text have to shut their mouth. It's just, it becomes a conspiracy theory that they're claiming.
Truth in that idea, since Revelation, as we know, is very repetitive. Still, Erasmus shows that he was aware of the problematic nature of his intervention, and he states that the problem of the first edition had been solved in the second. The text has been remedied by means of the Aldine edition, 1518. Erasmus is probably sincere here, but also seriously mistaken or misled.
So he's probably sincere, so he's probably not lying, he's just mistaken. So Joe Biden staring at the ceiling.
He never realized the nature of the Aldine New Testament text. So
he never realized the nature of it. Like, he lived with Aldous for how long? He was proofreading for this guy for 7 or 8 months. Lived with him, and best friends. They're part of the Byzantine school and everything. But he didn't know the nature of their Greek text. He did the first, Complutensian guys had done theirs, and, Erasmus can figure out a lot of their stuff, but he can't figure out the Aldine guys that he knows personally and all the rest of it.
Derived from Erasmus's own first edition, with only...
So the guys from Aldus just went, forget doing all this study. Let's just copy Erasmus's. So they just copied Erasmus's edition out. And so that's a whole thing that I've got to, put side by side, the text of Aldus and the text of Erasmus. But the thing is, these guys will, Aldus was printing Erasmus's books for many years. Erasmus would be there saying, are you going to print my Attica? I want to do another copy of that, but with your special font. Can we do this? And they're talking about the details of Latin books and Greek books and printing and all the rest of it, and he's proofreading for this guy, but he didn't know a major thing, that the Aldous guys just copied his work. I mean, I'm sure if I just copied Jan Kranz's work word for word, I'm sure that Jan Kranz would figure it out. You know what I mean? Like, after a while, you go, oh, someone's copying my work. What's it, Erasmus? He just didn't realize that they'd done. It's just another banana peel situation, which is very not believable. Very not believable. It seems ridiculous.
Some corrections, additional errors, and a few readings from other sources. For Revelations 22.
Notice that some corrections, a few errors. It's like there's a few differences there.
As well as for most other cases, the Aldine edition has no independent value at all. We can only speculate as to what would have happened had Erasmus been present in Basel when the Aldine edition was consulted.
So it's like, Erasmus is totally detached from this whole thing. He's just like, hey guys, can you just correct it from the Aldine edition? And then, and so they correct it, and he doesn't realize it's his own work, and it's this circular type of, error after error after error, In
any case, he regarded the matter as closed, or at least he thought he had sufficiently countered Lee's criticisms, As he writes somewhat further on, I did not have a manuscript in the first edition. In the second edition, I had the help of the Aldine edition. Therefore, I fulfilled the promise I had made in the first edition. Well, there's a lot.
Okay, so I did not have a manuscript in the first edition. In the second edition, I had the help of the Aldine edition. Therefore, I fulfilled the promise I had made in the first edition. So in his annotations, he's saying, you know, to fix it from the Aldine, I did not have a manuscript in the first edition. In the second edition, I had the help of the Aldine. Therefore, I fulfilled the promise I'd made in the first edition. So this has got to be, I've really got to look at the Latin in this because, and this is one of the things that Timothy Berg was saying, have you read this? This just blows your theory out of the water. And it's like, well, if you understand where I'm coming from, I'm not trusting that this has been accurately translated because I understand that when you're translating, that you have to have certain presuppositions about what they're talking about, and so the Aldine edition and things like that. I can take it at face value and go, okay, I can see it's like I did not have a manuscript in the first edition, 1516 edition. In the second edition, the 1519 edition, I had the help of the Aldine edition, the 1518. Therefore, I fulfilled the promise I had made in the first edition. So in the annotations, I said that I was going to do this, where he actually didn't really say that he was going to do this, but he just has it, written there. And then it's been done in the 1519, and so that error, that or that issue about the Latin, it's been fixed from the Aldine, and so it clearly is stating that. So I can understand that concept, and I can adopt that and go, okay, well, that means he only used one manuscript. I can't see how that fits in, whether he's saying Greek copies, plural. But then there's a whole nother side of that, where this could probably be translated this way. I did not have a manuscript in the first edition. And so in the first edition of his copy that he did from Reuchlin, in the second edition, I had the help of the Aldine. So when, so what happened when he was extrapolating the text from the commentary, the first one, he didn't have any other manuscript to help him. But then when he sent it off to the printers, they had the Aldine text, the draft, and they were able to utilize that and extrapolate the reading from that. And so therefore I fulfilled the promise I'd made in the first edition. And so that would be why he saying that there was a promise to do that. Like perhaps he'd written something separate to the printers about doing that. And so like a promise to them that or he was going to fix the Latin. So I'm sort of making that whole thing up sort of out of thin air, because it's like, okay, I'm trying to see how that could be interpreted without knowing the Latin, and that's why I've got to go through all the Latin. But you can sort of see that, like when Timothy Berg was like, oh, see, this is your gotcha moment. What about this? And it's like, well, I'm just not trusting that that's translated properly. I think people have a presupposition of, Erasmus only had one manuscript, he only had this and he only had that, and they're squeezing that into their Latin interpretation of it all. The Aldine becomes the Aldine editions. Now, it very well could be accurate, but what I'm saying is I'm questioning this. So I'll just let him go for a little bit more, but I might stop it very soon.
To do about the myths of Erasmian promises, but it should be noted that Erasmus did not make such an explicit promise in the first edition. There, as we see, he only mentions that he had added some words, but in his mind, he
So that's the thing. It's like, okay, so he doesn't mention a promise. So where is this promise? How come that, is the first edition of the annotations? Or is the first edition what he copied out? So that's where it's like, lots of things just don't add up, and so it's like Erasmus is talking about something completely different, but they always have to gravitate it back to, well, you only have one manuscript, so it has to be this. You only have this, so it has to be this, and they just keep directing his words into a certain direction. And it's like, um, is he just lying everywhere?
Interpreted this information in a twofold way. Readers who come across to the true Greek text or a better Greek text can supply it. But how would the reader know, actually? And he himself...
So perhaps when he's talking about the reader there, he's talking about the people in Basel. The reader could supply the text with the Aldine, so these are things that I go through.
Remedy the problem at the first occasion, but the effort failed without him noticing it. In the longer...
So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to, probably next video I'll start at 15. And we'll just keep going through that. So I'm nearly halfway through. And I think that was quite fruitful, quite interesting. I'm learning a lot, getting to the point where I'm starting to see avenues that I really need to go down, and where there's a few brick walls and I can't seem to go any further. Understanding the manuscript, the 2814 manuscript, I think I've got to read through that quite a bit more, learn a bit more about that. So we just got a couple more questions or more statements from B.E. Separate. He says, in Bengal's defense, many, if not most divines around that time, based on the 2,300-day-year prophecy of Daniel, thought Jesus was returning, or 1,000 years of peace would commence in 1830s, 1840s. And so I guess that's why you got the Millerites, the beginning of the Seventh-day Adventists, who eventually split into the Jehovah's Witnesses, Christadelphians, and things like that, and had Unitarian influence. So yeah, the Millerite movement, they predicted the 1843 return of Jesus. When that didn't happen, they just went 1844. That was called the Great Disappointment by the Seventh-day Adventists, and so it's quite interesting. That whole movement is just, it's called the Great Disappointment. Like, the whole movement's based on a false prophecy. It's quite interesting. Be separate and beyond. And he says, in taking a day as a prophetical term for a year, I believe you are sustained by the soundest exegesis, as well as fortified by the high names of Mead, Sir Isaac Newton, Bishop Newton, Kirby. Okay, well, that's interesting. Like I am a pre-tribulation guy, pre-millennial, stock standard 7-year tribulation. After that comes 1,000-year millennium reign, and these dates, they talk about in Daniel that they are literal days, and they talk about certain things, and so. Yeah, but that's a whole nother issue. About this age of the world, Dr. George Bush, Scott Keith and a host of others who have long since come to substantially your conclusions on this head, they all agree that the leading periods mentioned in Daniel and John do actually expire. About this age of the world, Dr. George Bush letter to William Miller, published in the Advent Herald and Signs of the Times Reporter, Boston, March 6 and 13, 1844. Okay, so that would be the Millerite movement. Okay, so I'm not a Seventh-day Adventist, but yeah, so I would say that I agree with the conclusions that are in the Dictionary of Premillennial Theology, or Encyclopedia of Premillennial Theology, and I believe in a pre-tribulational rapture, and I've actually debated Seventh-day Adventists over this, and I used to work for a guy who was a 7-day Adventist, and I actually had two bosses who were Sebbies, and full on into it. You can't. Friday night is sundown. That's it. But you can start work again on Saturday night and all that sort of stuff, and so um, quite interesting. But yeah, so I won't get too much into that. I did have a request to talk about the pre-trib rapture. Um, and to do a video on it, and so I'll probably get onto that when I've got a bit of time. I think I've already done a few pre-tribs videos on Facebook, so I might even be able to find one that sort of explains it all, where I've gone and done all the homework to save me sort of doing it again. But I did get a request for that, so yeah, I've got a few things up my sleeve to do. But yeah, I think it was fruitful going through this discussion. And I think it's very good going through what young Cron says here, because we're just getting it straight from the horse's mouth. Jan is probably, the go-to guy for this type of thing on Erasmus and Revelation, and so we'll continue going through his material. We'll go through beyond what he's written. We'll go through his critique of Holland. And and we'll just sort of exhaust young Franz's material, and then we'll any stuff that is new, like if I'm able to get these parts here retranslated into Latin, or I find 3 or 4 other Latin editions and we can compare them and have a good look at them. I'll do a video on it, and so we'll just focus in on these issues. And so I've also got 1 John 5:7, it's got some good material on that. I get sent material all the time by people. I was just looking today, another maybe 6 or 7 quotations from church writers about the comma, ranging from, I think it was 310, the year 310, all the way through to like 1200, and so just stuff that no one's brought up before, just thrown in there. There's a interesting guy who works for the Library of Congress, and so he's often going through material and just searching through their database and finding keywords, and he's collecting stuff about the comma. There's so much. It's been quoted so frequently in Greek and in Latin and many other languages that it's like, it was there. Anyway, I'm going to bail. Thanks for joining us, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this. If you can sense I'm a little bit tired, it's just a bit late here. So it's just on 12. It's about 3 minutes to 12, nearly Saturday morning. God bless you, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.